Okay, here we are on lesson 5, and the subject of this lesson is how to determine the market value of a property. And I must confess, this is tricky in today's market. So pay attention to this lesson. A lot of investors are having trouble with this, and you'll see why as we go through the lesson, and you'll see how you can overcome that. In fact, the fear of not determining the true market value of the property keeps a lot of people from making offers because they're just afraid. Maybe by the time we're through with this lesson, you can see why that should not stop you from doing so. You should never, ever, ever make an offer on anything for that matter, especially real estate, unless you have an idea of what the market value of the property is. And in order to do that, we have to first determine the ARV, as we call it, or the after repaired value. And one of the biggest mistakes that new investors make is they pay too much for the house. And if you aren't good at determining the comps, or at least if you aren't good enough to move forward and begin making offers, then it's likely you will pay too much for the house. On the other hand, if you learn to reduce your risk, and as we'll see at the end of the lesson, if you verify your assumptions prior to taking any risk, then obviously you can't get hurt. But we do have to determine the market value before we can make the offer, and you should never, ever, ever make an offer unless you can do that. If you buy it correctly, you can make a lot of mistakes and still make a lot of money. If you pay too much and you do everything else correctly, you could lose money if you have any at risk. And you could certainly lose your profit and wind up working for nothing if you're not careful. Paying too much is caused by not learning how to determine the market value. And my friend, I got to tell you, if you're going to be in real estate, you have to have a system to determine market value, and you have to get comfortable at it enough to where you feel like you're somewhere in the ballpark on the after repaired value. And don't be an eager beaver and do a deal without really knowing what the value is and ignoring your training, because if you do, then you're going to learn the lessons the hard way. The purpose of this lesson is to try to just give you enough confidence. I'm not going to make you an expert here, but maybe we can just give you enough confidence to get out there and get the offers flowing. And of course, the more offers you make, the better you're going to get at determining the market value of the property. And don't get lazy after you do know how to get the comps. Sometimes I see students just assuming they know the value without doing any homework, especially if you're going into a neighborhood you don't know. It's critical that you do a little homework first, and I'll show you how to do that right here, and then proceed with a conviction that you're somewhere in the ballpark. Now, the current market value, I call it ARV, and that stands for after repaired value. Now please look at the bottom of your screen. It's the only value we need in both the pretty house and the ugly house business. You do not need to worry about what the as-is value is. As-is not ARV. ARV is after repaired value. Let's assume that the property is in excellent shape, ready to put a qualified buyer in who's going to go down and get a loan. And ARV is the value by which we think if we had it appraised, the appraiser would come in and put on it. And the as-is value, frankly, is just a wild guess. It's a wild guess from anybody who's trying to determine the as-is value. And in fact, when you hear the word BPO, when you hear that a lot in the short sale industry, that stands for broker's price opinion. A broker's price opinion is an as-is value put on the property by a realtor. And sometimes those realtors are not very well trained, and in fact, in today's market, I see a lot of them actually putting the BPO on the property without doing their homework, as we're going to discuss on this lesson. And many times those BPOs come in very, very low, which is definitely an advantage for you as a buyer if those BPOs come in low. But the reason they come in low is because the realtor is very conservative and they're using the wrong comps, as we're going to get into here in a minute, to put an ARV. Now remember, ARV is the after repaired value. It is critical that you understand that that may not be my sales price. In fact, I do not expect to sell the property for ARV, especially in a market on the low-end properties that we have today. I find myself giving away some equity, discounting the price in exchange for getting a qualified buyer in the property. So you can't count on you selling it for ARV. If you do, and your only exit is to cash out, I'm afraid you're going to get some lessons in the School of Hard Knocks, and you're going to see your profit dwindle. So what I'm trying to get you to do is to determine what the RV is, and then as we get into the offer making process, then we'll build our conservatism into that process, not into the R. And comps, when I say comps, commonly referred to as a CMA, which is a comparable market analysis. That's what your realtors will call them. We call them comps, they call them comps. So comps is slang for comparable market analysis. All right, where are we going to get comps? Well, there's a ton of websites. I'm going to put a few of them up here for you. And if you are, in fact, a Gold Club member, you'll find them also listed in your resource center on your membership site. Your homework assignment is to copy down this list right here. And I'll give you a minute to do that. If you got something to write on, go ahead and copy that list down. That's a good start. But remember, you can go to your membership site under the resource section and get all of these you want anyway. And you can do your own search on Google if you like and pull up tons and tons and tons of websites where you can go pull down comps. Now, I got to warn you, I'm not a fan of Zillow. Zillow is a free comp service, and frankly, around my office and from what I'm hearing from a lot of students, I wouldn't put too much faith in the Zillow comps. To be honest with you, the best comps you're going to get is from a service that you pay a monthly fee for, such as realquest.com or sitexdata.com. Both of these have been proven to be good websites to pull up comps, but there are some free ones out there. Just as long as you make sure you're getting good comps and not old, dilapidated data. In fact, in a minute, we'll figure out how to make sure it is a good comp so you don't fall into that trap. In fact, here are the three major things that you are looking for to determine whether you have a true comp. First is the most recent sale, and I mean recent. If you're looking at a sale in today's market that's more than 3 or 4 months old, you should look real hard for more recent sales. In fact, when I pull up a list of sold properties that are comparable to my property on one of those websites that I'm showing you, the first thing I want to see is the date that property sold. Do not use comps unless you can see the date the property sold. And if it isn't within the last 3 or 4 months, look harder. If you can't find any within that range, then you're just going to have to go back until you do find them. And look, I'll use a 6-month comp sometimes if I have to, but in my head, I'm going to ask myself, what happened to the market values where I live in the past 6 months? And I just might adjust that comp downward a little bit if I need to, if I really can't get good, true comps. A sale, the most recent sale that you can find is the best you can do, and that's all the appraiser is going to do. So in fact, it wouldn't hurt if you use 2 or 3 different websites just to see if you can pull up some sales that the one your primary website missed. Just get me recent sales. And also, the property must be close in proximity. That means I cannot use a comp that is 3 miles away from my house. And you got to be careful with this one, because a close in proximity means if you can find them in the same subdivision. Try your best to find comps that are right there in the same area that your house is, that your subject is, so that you don't have to get out of that subdivision. I'll feel better if you don't cross any major highways, and if you do cross major highways, you darn sure better make sure that the property values on the other side of the street are similar to the subject that you're looking at, because in many cases you'll see vast differences if you just cross the street. Now here's some websites that you can go to pull up maps, and here's what I suggest you do. Pull up a map from a Google Maps. Google Maps is about as good as any. Earth.google.com, Google Maps, any of those that you see on your screen. Yahoo's got one, mapblast.com, mapquest.com. I'm sure you've probably already pulled up similar maps to get directions on where you want to go. However, when I pull up the map, I try to use a service that I can have a what do you call it, a pin or a dot put on the map where the comp is. So just picture this in your head. I got a map and it's showing my area where my subject is, and it'll put a dot where your subject is, But try to use one of these map services that will put a dot where all of your so-called comps are, and then you can just take a look at the map and see if it's very close to your comp or how far away it is. And of course, you can spot those major highways or waterways between your comp and the subject. Just do the best you can do, and don't get hung up on the details. Just do the best you can do. It's all I'm asking you to do. And next, it's close in size. You cannot compare a 1,500 square foot house with a 2,500 square foot house. You just can't. And don't get caught up in the square foot multiplier trap either. If a house is selling for, in the area where you're at, if your average retail to consumer arm's length sale was about $100 a foot, say, in other words, if you had a 2,000 square foot house and it sold for $200,000, then it sold for $100 a foot. However, you can't take a 1,500 square foot house that sold for $100 a foot and just assume that a $2,500 house or 2,500 square foot house is worth $100 a foot. It just doesn't work that way. So you want to find comps that are as close in size to yours as you can. In some areas, you will not have any problem getting the square footage, but if you cannot get the square footage on your comps where you live, then the best you're going to be able to do is a bedroom and bathroom comparison. In other words, if I've got a 3-bedroom, 2-bath subject, then I'm looking for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath comp. Now, I don't care about that if I've got square footage is listed. In other words, I can compare a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,500 square foot to a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,528 square foot house, and they're both going to be worth about the same. Please don't let anybody convince you that a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house will appraise for more than a 2-bedroom, 2-bath house. I'm not saying that it might not be more sellable, because it might in some areas. However, when you're appraising a property, they're going to appraise it by the square foot, and they're going to use comps based on similar square footage. So I've heard a lot of students tell me that they were told that a 3-bedroom is worth more than a 2-bedroom. That is just not the case. And if you're looking for comps, you don't have to have them right on the money. In other words, you don't have to have a 1,550 square foot house to compare to a 1,500. But when you start getting between 10 and 15% larger or smaller, you should probably discount that comp and look for something closer in square footage. If you can't find something closer in square footage, then you are going to have to make an adjustment. For example, if my subject is a 1,500 square foot house, and the closest thing I can find is an 1,150 square foot house, well, then common sense will tell you that the 1,500 square foot is worth more than the 1,150, so you can't assume that they are worth the same just because they're close together. If they're more than 10% or so apart in square footage, you're going to have to adjust upward. If I'm using 1,150 square foot as a comp, then my 1,500 square foot is worth more. And that's where you might go in and figure out what your square foot multiplier is, and just use a little bit of math and common sense and come to your best conclusion. Again, you're not going to get perfect at this, and I don't care how good you get at it. You're only going to do the best you can to determine what the ARV is as close as you can. Even appraisers will have a vast difference in their ARV sometimes because of the comps they choose to use. All right, here's what you don't want to do. Don't try, I just told you that. Don't use a price per square foot. We went over that. And don't use the tax assessed value either. My friend, tax assessed value has nothing to do with ARV. It's a value put on by the city. And in fact, most cities don't even go reassess the properties except about every 3 years. And when they assess them, they're not looking for the same market value you are. And when they do assess properties, it's a drive-by. And their main focus is to see if there's any major additions been added to it and to just update their records. If you use a tax assessed value to try to determine what your market value is, your ARV is not going to be correct unless you just get lucky. And in fact, most areas across the country, the tax assessed value is well below the true ARV. And in fact, I've seen cases where it was a third of the true R. Of course, if you're the property owner, that's a good thing, but if you're using that as a comp, that's a bad thing. Don't use a comp that was in poor condition. If my subject, if I'm trying to determine the ARV, the after repaired value on my subject, and I'm using a comp that was sold in not such good condition, then obviously that comp is going to sell for less than what my house will once I get it renovated. So I'm looking for properties that are close in proximity, recently sold, and close in square footage that appear to have been in good shape when they sold. And about the only way you can determine whether they were is if you've got 2 or 3 properties that are similar in size that sold for a very similar sales price. So if I've got 3 houses, one of them sold for 110 and another one sold for 123 and another one sold for 118, I've got good comps as long as they're close in proximity and similar in square footage. And I can just assume that those properties all sold arm's length to qualified buyers in good condition. And if that bothers you, you can always go take a look at to see what the comps look like, which is not a bad practice anyway. If you're out and about and you're in the neighborhood and you're shaky on this comp stuff, just go take a look at 2 or 3 of the comps that you're using and see how they compare to your house. And if there's a big discrepancy, you'll instantly spot it. If your subject is a 1,500 square foot house, 2-story, and it's sitting in a nice neighborhood, and you go look at one of the comps, and it is just a gorgeous house with a lot of sex appeal, and it's got a lot of nice, beautiful landscaping out front, and then you find out it's got a pool in the back, well, that comp is worth more than your comp. I mean, that comp is worth more than your subject. So a little common sense here. Just make sure you're doing your best to compare apples to apples. So, as I said, pick out 3 comps that sold for as close as together as possible, and I think you're probably going to find that you're on the right track. However, you must ignore all bank repos, and that is what mistake that a lot of people are making out there today. They are using bank repos for comps, and as I said earlier, sometimes the realtors will do that when they're doing BPOs for banks, and that's what drives down the market value or the asking price that the bank puts on the property when they get ready to sell it. And again, that's a really good thing when we're out here buying bank REOs, but it's a bad thing if you're using that bank sold deeply discounted property as a comp for your subject. And don't get so conservative on your ARV that you price yourself right out of a deal. If I had to pinpoint one of the biggest mistakes that people make when they begin, it's probably that one. They're trying to super conservatize their ARV. Now let's go back a minute. Our ARV is not our sales price, but it is what we think the property would appraise for if it's in excellent condition. When we get into making offers, the ARV will be used to determine what our offer is, but again, we're not assuming we're going to sell it for that, so our conservatism will be built into our offer, not into our ARV. So if you got a house that you think it looks like it might be worth $125,000, and then you throw a $110,000 ARV on it just because you're conservative, obviously that's going to affect your offer and very well may price you right out of business because you're trying to be conservative on both ends. Don't do it. And don't ever use an appraisal given to you by the seller. Any appraisal that was ordered by the seller or by the seller's lender for a refi is a worthless piece of paper to you. In fact, you're better off if you don't even look at it, don't even ask for it, don't even get it, and ignore it, because it's probably not the true ARV, and especially if there's any age to it. Please don't ever get caught up in the trap of using an appraisal that was done a year ago, whether somebody else ordered it or you ordered it or what. Just don't use it. The appraisal's too old. But again, if it was ordered by someone besides you, it is not something that you should rely on if you are at risk. And here's some more ways to get comps. Obviously, realtors can get you comps. They have the MLS system sitting right there at their fingertips. And most realtors will pull comps for you. So if you simply ask them, if they have any reason to believe that you're going to do business with them, they're happy to do it. And in fact, you can pay them to do it as well. And their MLS system is about as good a comp service as you're ever going to find. But if you're not a licensed realtor, then you can't get into it unless you want to become a licensed realtor. And people ask me all the time, should I become a realtor? And my answer is yes and no. I don't have any problem at all if you go get a license. However, do it for the right reasons. You're not getting a license to get rich in real estate. Realtors are not getting rich in real estate. They're making a living. And in fact, sometimes they're walking over the dollars to get to the dimes. They're ignoring all of the wealth that could come from the product that they choose to sell for a small fee. And that does require a license. Anytime you are providing any of the 7 functions of real estate, then you will 7 services, you will need a license. However, when you're looking to buy a property yourself and or sell it yourself, you do not need a license in any state or in Canada for that matter. But if you want to go get a license, there are advantages and there are disadvantages. I think one of the biggest advantages is that the MLS system is sitting right there in your home, right there at your fingertips anytime you need it. On the other hand, there are so many good comp services on the internet today that, that may not be a big enough advantage to go get a license. You do get the keys to get in all the vacant houses that are bank owned, and that can be a big advantage to you as well. You don't ever have to call realtors to get the code or get the key or whatever. And a little education that you're going to get when you go get a license is not going to hurt you as well. Now, they are not going to teach you how to buy houses. And in fact, they don't even teach you how to be a realtor. They just basically teach you the practices and principles. They'll teach you how to what you'll need to pass the test. And you'll learn a lot of good stuff. But it won't make you a better investor. It will make you better equipped, however, with good information that will never hurt you. You can't ever learn too much. And again, if you go get a license, at least you're hanging around licensed folks. That may put you in a good position to get some deals that you won't get any other way and might get you on the inside circle. But be careful because there's disadvantages as well to getting a license. Number one, you're going to need a broker to place your license with, or you're not going to be able to use that license, and you're probably not going to be able to even get the MLS. And that broker's got to be cooperative, and sometimes they're not. That broker has to be investor friendly, and sometimes they're not. And that broker has to be willing to allow you to do your business without them getting involved in your business. And many brokers expect an agent to pay them a commission even when they buy a house for their own purposes. So if you're going to go get a license, you might want to do a little bit of homework to find out what broker would be user-friendly that you'd want to put that license with. Now, that broker is responsible for your actions as an agent, so don't take that responsibility lightly because they won't. But if you just comply with the rules and you've got a broker that is user-friendly, that could be a big advantage for you. And again, it could be a disadvantage if you get a license because you do have to disclose that you're an agent. Now, I was an agent for a while. That never bothered me one bit. I can tell you right now that your sellers don't care. If they're the kind of sellers you're dealing with, the fact that you're an agent is irrelevant. As soon as they find out you're there to buy the property, the fact that you have a license probably would give you more credibility. It certainly shouldn't keep anybody from selling you their house. In fact, if it does, you probably wouldn't be buying that house anyway. You will have to go sit through a class. In most areas, that class is up to 7 days long. And that is a sacrifice that you're going to have to make. I mean, and of course, that keeps a lot of people from getting a license because that is a long time to sit through a class. But if you do it once, you probably will have to have some updated training along the way. Many states require you to go sit through a refresher class at least once a year. So you'll know this well before you get deep into getting yourself a license. You'll know the requirements that are involved and the ongoing training. And of course, you are going to run across some negative attitudes with realtors. Many of them just do not like investors. They feel like we're stealing the business from them. In fact, that's actually not the case, but you can't fight attitude. So you are going to have to deal with that. And if you are a licensed agent and you do get a license, you definitely are going to have to disclose getting in and getting out, but that really shouldn't be a problem. Here's a easy, safe way to get comps. I discussed it a little bit earlier, but you can always drive the neighborhood and look for properties with signs on them that are listed or for sale by owners, and call the agents and call the owners and just see what they're asking and see how those prices compare to yours. Now, if you're out into the marketplace, that's probably not a bad idea for you to do anyway. You should at least see what your competition is by calling these signs that are in front of the properties, because if you've got several properties in the neighborhood that are asking for their house well below what you think the ARV is, then of course you're going to have to deal with that when you get ready to sell the property. So that should help you with your decision on putting a ARV on the property if you just do a little bit of homework. You don't have to be an expert at getting comps, especially if you're wholesaling a house or if you're not taking any risk. If you're not writing a big check and or guaranteeing debt, and of course if you're guaranteeing debt, your bank is going to want to get it appraised anyway, so your valuation of comps will soon be verified whether you like it or not. And if the appraiser's valuation is much lower than yours, then you won't wind up getting the loan. Of course, getting the loan is not what I'd like to see you do anyway, so I hope you don't get to that point. But if you're going to write a check or to buy a house or in any way put yourself at risk, you should verify your estimated value by getting that appraisal before you close and before you put yourself at risk. Again, if you're going to be at risk, please don't assume that you're good enough to determine the market value just because you pull some comps up off of one of the services on the web. However, if you're not going to be at risk, for example, let's say you're making an offer on a bank-owned property and you intend to wholesale it, well, then you'll have no reason to get it appraised. Your buyer will determine what they think it's worth, and they'll buy based on that. So if you've done your homework and your comps are reasonable, then there should not be any reason for them not to buy if value is the concern. So getting comps is a vital part of your business. Determining the ARV is critical before you go make offers. Again, it's going to take a little while for you to get acclimated to it. It is going to scare you on the front end, and you're going to see an awful lot of properties that sold for a lot less than what you think the ARV is. But just go back and pick 2 or 3 of the best comps you can find based on this discussion and do your best to put an ARV on it. And I promise you, not more than 2 or 3 months will go by and you'll be really, really good at it. All right, that's the end of lesson 5. And coming up in lesson 6, this is another one that scares some people. We're going to get involved in estimating repairs quickly and easily. And in fact, when I get through with you, you won't even need a calculator or a pen to do it with.